Welcome to the Blackout Witness. When the power goes out, everything changes. Streets turn silent, houses become shadows, and for a few minutes, the world feels much bigger and much less safe. Tonight's stories come from people who saw something during those dark hours. Some were alone, some had nowhere to run, and some still do not know what was watching them when the lights finally came back on. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a slow, unsettling feel, subscribe to the Blackout Witness. Turn off the lights, if you dare. Let's begin. My family owns property that has been in the family since around 1910. The original cabin on the land was built sometime in the late 1800s, long before any of us who grew up visiting it were born. By the time I was a kid, it had already been standing there for well over a century. It was not a fancy place, and it was never meant to be. It was a small mountain cabin that had been added onto over time as the needs of the family changed. The original part of the cabin was simple. There was an old living room and an old bedroom, which had been part of the first structure built on the property. Those rooms had remained mostly untouched over the years. They still had the same basic feel they must have had generations earlier. Old wood, uneven floors, thick walls, and the kind of quiet that only comes from a building that has been standing in the same place for a very long time. In the 1940s, additions were built onto one side of the cabin. That was when a kitchen, bathroom, and another bedroom were added. Those rooms were newer by comparison, but even they were old by the time I knew the place. The different sections of the house never felt completely connected. You could tell when you stepped from one era of the cabin into another. The newer rooms had a slightly different layout. The floors changed. The ceiling height changed. The way sound traveled changed. And once you entered the original cabin section, especially the old living room and original bedroom, the house seemed to become quieter in a way that was difficult to explain. The property was in the mountains, down at the bottom of a canyon beside a creek. There were not many people living nearby year-round. Some cabins were used only during certain seasons. Some properties sat empty for long periods. During the day, the area was beautiful. There were trees, hillsides, the sound of water moving through the creek, and the kind of clean mountain air that made city life feel far away. It was a weekend getaway for me while I was growing up. My mom had grown up there too. Her dad had lived there. His parents had lived there. The house had been part of our family for so long that every room seemed to hold stories. There were memories attached to everything. The old furniture, the kitchen table, the porch, the creek, the drive up through the canyon, the old bedroom where generations of family members had slept. To my mom, it was not just an old cabin. It was home. She had spent her childhood there. She knew the sounds of the creek of the floors, the way the wind moved through the canyon, and the noises the house made in different seasons. That was probably why she was never as frightened by the strange things as I was. To her, the cabin had always had activity. She did not necessarily call it haunted. She did not speak about it in a dramatic way. She had a simple explanation for it. Relatives were visiting. That was what she said whenever someone heard something they could not explain. A grandparent. A great-grandparent. Someone from the family who had lived there long before us. Someone checking in on the old place. As a kid, I did not know what to do with that explanation. Part of me found it comforting. If the noises came from family, then they were not dangerous. They were just familiar people from another time, still attached to the house. But another part of me did not like the thought of someone walking through the cabin when nobody was there. The nights were the worst. The house sat low in the canyon, and once the sun went down, it became extremely dark. There were no bright streetlights outside, no nearby neighborhood full of lit windows, no constant sound of cars passing. The mountains and trees blocked what little light there might have been, and the canyon seemed to swallow everything. At night, the darkness outside the cabin felt complete. You could stand at the window and see almost nothing beyond the faint outline of trees or the reflection of the room behind you. The creek could be heard somewhere nearby, a steady moving sound in the blackness. Sometimes the wind would move through the branches. Sometimes an animal would make a noise in the distance. But usually, once everyone went inside, the place became very quiet. Too quiet. That was when the strange things happened. Not huge things, not every night. Nothing that would make someone run out of the house screaming. It was always smaller than that. A voice at the wrong time. A sound from an empty room. A floor creaking in a way that suggested someone was walking through the house. A light bulb suddenly exploding. Little things that could each be explained away on their own, but began to feel different after years of hearing them. The voices were one of the things people remembered most. They would happen around 11 at night. That was the hour when the cabin was usually settled down. Dinner was over, dishes had been washed. People were either sitting quietly in the living room, getting ready for bed, or already asleep. The house would be calm, with only the creek outside and the occasional old building noise breaking the silence. Then someone would hear a voice. Not always clear enough to understand. Sometimes it sounded like a low conversation from another room. Sometimes it sounded like someone saying something softly down the hall. Sometimes it was only the shape of a voice, a brief human sound that made you look up and ask, "Did someone say something?" But nobody had. You would check the rooms. You would look into the kitchen, the bathroom, the old bedroom, or the hallway. Nothing. The cabin would be empty except for the people you already knew were there. And then, after a moment, everything would be quiet again. The strangest part was how normal everyone eventually became about it. When you spend enough time in a place, even the weird things become part of the routine. Someone might hear a voice and ask if anyone else heard it. Another person might say no. Someone might shrug and go back to what they were doing. My mom would often say it was probably family. "They're just visiting," she would say, and nobody could prove otherwise. The light bulbs were another thing. Every now and then, one would explode, not simply burn out, not dim and flicker for a few seconds before going dark, actually explode. There would be a sudden sharp pop, loud enough to make everyone jump, followed by the small sound of glass hitting the floor or scattering in the fixture. Sometimes it happened while people were in the room. Sometimes it happened when nobody had touched the light. A person might be sitting in the old living room, talking quietly, and suddenly the bulb overhead would burst. The room would go dark for a second. Everyone would freeze. Then someone would find a flashlight, clean up the broken glass, and replace the bulb. There are normal reasons bulbs can do that. Old wiring, voltage fluctuations, loose connections, cheap bulbs, a fixture overheating. The cabin had been old, and not everything about it had been modern or perfect. It was possible that the electrical system had its own problems, but when it happened in a house already known for voices and footsteps, it never felt completely ordinary. The footsteps were probably the most common thing. You could be lying in the original bedroom at night, trying to sleep, and hear the floor creaking from the living room. It would start with one creak, then another, then a slow sequence, as though someone was walking across the floor. The sound would move through the old part of the cabin. It would seem to come closer. A person lying in bed would wait for someone to round the corner. You would expect to see your mom, your grandfather, another relative, or someone who had gotten up to get water. But nobody came. The footsteps would stop. The house would go still, and the corner would remain empty. That was the part that unsettled me most as a child. I could understand an old house creaking. I knew wood expands and contracts. I knew temperatures change. I knew old floorboards make noise. But the sounds did not always feel random. They seemed to have a direction. They seemed to have a pace. They sounded like weight moving from one board to another, like someone walking down the hall and stopping just out of sight. I would lie there under the covers, staring toward the open doorway, waiting for whoever it was to appear. Sometimes I would call out, softly, "Mom?" No answer. I would wait. Nothing. Then I would pull the blanket higher and try not to think about it. The cabin had a strange layout, and that made the sounds harder to explain away. The old living room and bedroom were part of the original structure, and the additions built in the 1940s had created transitions between rooms where you could hear someone moving without seeing them immediately. A person could walk from the kitchen through the older rooms. A person could cross from one side of the house to the other. At night, every step carried. That was why the footsteps were so believable. They sounded exactly like someone moving through the house, but there was never anyone there. One of the odd things about the cabin was that the experiences never seemed to become more aggressive. They did not escalate into anything obviously dangerous. Nobody was hurt. No one saw a clear figure standing in a room. No doors were thrown open by themselves in front of a group of people. It was always just enough to make you uncomfortable, enough to make you listen, enough to make you question whether you had really heard what you thought you heard. Maybe that was why my mom could remain so calm about it. To her, it was not a threatening house. It was an old family place filled with old family energy. She had grown up there. Her father had lived there. His parents had lived there. The cabin had watched generations of people come and go. It had held birthdays, holidays, weekend trips, arguments, laughter, grief, children playing, adults cooking, people getting older, and relatives passing away. Maybe, to my mom, it made sense that traces of those people remained. Maybe they were not ghosts in the scary movie sense. Maybe they were just echoes. Maybe the house had learned the sounds of the people who lived there for so long that sometimes it repeated them. Or maybe it was just an old building doing old building things. I have never known for sure. What I do know is that the weird things stopped after the cabin was torn down. In 2006, my parents decided to tear down the old structure and build their retirement home on the property. It was a major change. The old cabin had been there since the late 1800s. It had survived weather, mountain winters, family changes, additions, repairs, and more than a century of people living in and around it. But eventually, it was too old. It had been patched and expanded over the years, but there comes a point when a building is no longer practical to maintain. My parents wanted a home they could live in comfortably as they got older. They wanted something safer, newer, more reliable, and better suited to the future. So the cabin came down. The original living room was gone. The original bedroom was gone. The old addition from the 1940s was gone too. The place where my mom had grown up, where her dad had lived, where generations of the family had spent time, became a memory. A new retirement home was built on the property. And after that, all the weird things stopped. No more voices around 11 at night. No more unexplained footsteps moving through the old living room. No more bulbs exploding without warning. No more lying in bed and waiting for someone to round the corner. Nothing. The new house was quiet. Normal quiet. The kind of quiet that does not make you listen for a second sound behind the first one. The kind of quiet that lets you sleep. That does not prove anything, of course. There are plenty of practical explanations. The old cabin had old wiring, uneven floors, settling wood, old fixtures, and a structure that had been modified over many decades. The voices might have been the wind in the canyon, sound from the creek, or voices carrying from far away in a way that made them seem closer. The footsteps might have been wood shifting as temperatures changed during the night. The exploding bulbs might have been electrical problems. Tearing the cabin down removed all of that. A newer house would have better wiring, more stable floors, better insulation, and fewer strange sounds. It makes perfect sense that the activity would stop. But I still think about the timing. The weird things happened in the old house. They did not follow the family. They did not continue in the new retirement home. They ended when the original cabin was gone. And that is why a part of me still wonders whether my mom was right. Maybe it was relatives visiting. Maybe the old cabin held something of the people who had lived there. Maybe the sounds belonged to 100 years of family life repeating itself in small pieces. A voice in the hallway at 11. A floor creaking as someone crossed the old living room. A light suddenly popping in the darkness. Nothing violent. Nothing threatening. Just reminders that the house had never felt completely empty. My mom never seemed afraid of it. She had spent too much of her life there to be afraid. To her, the old cabin was full of family. It had always been full of family. And perhaps, in some way none of us can properly explain, it stayed that way even after some of them were gone. Then, the cabin was torn down. The sounds stopped. And the mountain property became quiet again. We were on a 2-day hunt for feral hogs in Florida when something happened that neither my hunting buddy nor I have ever been able to explain. It was not the kind of place where you could casually lose track of your surroundings. The property was remote, covered in palmetto scrub, thick brush, uneven ground, and stretches of woods that all looked similar once you were deep inside them. It was good country for hogs, which was why we were there, but it was not forgiving country to move through. You had to pay attention to where you were walking, where your partner was, and where the water was. The creek was the main landmark. It ran almost directly north to south through the area, like a long dividing line through the woods. It was not especially wide. In many places, an athletic person could jump across the water itself without much trouble. If you found a narrow point, or a spot where the banks were shaped right, you could get across without getting wet. But the creek was not easy to cross. The water was the least difficult part. The creek bed was deep, deeper than a person's head in many places. The ground dropped down sharply from the surrounding woods, so crossing meant more than simply stepping over a small stream. You had to find a place where you could climb down safely. You had to make your way into the creek bed, cross the water, and then climb the other side. The banks were not gentle. They were steep enough that you had to choose your spot carefully. There were places where loose dirt, roots, wet ground, and brush made it difficult to get down without sliding. The climb back up on the other side was not something you would forget. Even if you crossed at a good spot, it took effort. It was a physical, noticeable event. You knew when you crossed that creek. That detail is important because the entire strange experience depended on it. There was no way to casually step over the creek without remembering. There was no way to wander from one bank to the other by accident. There was no shallow little crossing hidden in the grass that could carry you across without you noticing. If you crossed, you climbed down into that deep channel, got over the water, and climbed back up again. You would remember it. The first morning of the hunt, we parked our vehicles near one of the trail crossings and began moving south along the western bank of the creek. The western side was the side where our cars were. The eastern side had a different feel to it and different landmarks. There were power lines over there, visible through the palmetto scrub if you reached the right open area. There were no power lines near where we had parked. That was one of the clearest ways to tell which side of the creek you were on. We had a plan. We would walk south along the western bank for roughly 1.5 miles between two trail crossings, cover likely hog areas, check the thick brush and low ground, then turn around and work our way back toward the cars. It was a simple route. We were not wandering randomly. We were following the creek, keeping it on one side of us and using it as a consistent landmark. The morning started normally. The air was cool enough that the woods still felt damp. The palmettos held moisture. The ground was soft in places, and every now and then you had to push through thicker vegetation or step around fallen branches. We moved slowly, scanning the ground for signs of hogs, rooting, tracks, disturbed soil, muddy spots, anything that showed they had been feeding or passing through recently. A hog hunt is not like walking down a clean trail. You are constantly watching. You look for fresh damage in the ground. You listen for movement in thick cover. You stop every so often to check the wind, because hogs have an incredible sense of smell. You keep your eyes on every open patch and every dark gap in the brush. The creek remained nearby as we moved south. Sometimes we could see it through the trees. Sometimes we could hear the water. Sometimes the brush grew thick enough that the creek disappeared from view. But we knew it was there because we had been following it from the start. We stayed on the western bank. Neither of us crossed. I know that because there was no reason to cross. We were working the side where we had started. We were moving south, then planned to turn around and come back. The creek was an obstacle, not something we wanted to deal with unless there was a good reason. For a couple of hours we hunted like that. Nothing extraordinary happened. We moved through the woods, talked quietly when we needed to, checked likely spots, and continued along the creek. At some point, we reached the stopping point we had agreed on. It was time to turn around and head back toward the cars. So we did. We began walking north again, retracing the general route. The return trip should have been easy. The creek was still our guide. The cars were still on the western side. We had never crossed. All we had to do was keep moving north along the same bank until we reached the area where we had parked. But after a while, something felt off. At first, it was subtle. The woods began to look unfamiliar. Not completely impossible, not like we had suddenly walked into a different forest, but unfamiliar enough that both of us noticed. The brush did not look like we remembered. The openings seemed wrong. The trees and palmettos did not match the mental picture we had built while walking south. That can happen in the woods. Everything can look different when you reverse direction. A path that seems obvious while you are moving south can look unfamiliar when you are walking north. The sun shifts, shadows change. You notice different trees. A slight curve in the creek can make you feel like you are somewhere else. So at first, we did not panic. We kept moving, but then we reached an opening where we could see out across the palmetto scrub, and we saw power lines. That stopped us. The power lines were on the eastern side of the creek. We knew that. We had seen them from that side before. We knew the cars were not near power lines. The spot where we had parked was on the western side, away from them. For a moment, we just stood there staring. There were the power lines, exactly where they should be if we were on the east side of the creek. But we had been walking the west side all morning. We had not crossed. Neither of us remembered climbing down the bank, crossing the water, or climbing back up. There was no way either of us would forget that. Still, the power lines were there. We looked around, trying to orient ourselves. Maybe we had made some huge mistake. Maybe we had unknowingly crossed at a shallow point. Maybe there was a bend in the creek that made the geography more confusing than we realized. Maybe the creek curved in such a way that we thought we were on one side when we were actually on the other. That seemed possible, even if it did not feel right. The woods can make you stupidly confident. You think you know where you are because you have been walking in a straight line. But terrain can trick you. A creek can bend. A trail can turn. Thick vegetation can block the landmarks you need. So we did the practical thing. We crossed the creek. This time, we absolutely remembered it. We found a spot where we could climb down. We worked our way into the deep creek bed. We crossed the water. Then we climbed back up on the other side. It took effort. It was not something either of us could have done without noticing. When we reached the top and stepped out of the woods, we found our cars. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. The whole thing left us scratching our heads. We stood there for a while talking it over. How had we ended up on the east side? When had we crossed? Neither of us had any memory of doing it. We both remembered walking south on the western bank. We both remembered turning around. We both remembered walking north on the western bank. Then suddenly, we had been standing near the power lines on the other side. It was strange, but we did not make too much of it. There are always ways to explain getting turned around outdoors. We had been hunting for hours. We had been focusing on tracks, brush, and animal movement. Maybe we had found a crossing and used it automatically without thinking. Maybe we had crossed at a point that did not feel as dramatic as the ones we remembered. Maybe the creek had curved around us in a way that confused our sense of direction. We joked about it a little. We said we must have both had a mental lapse. Then, we let it go, at least until the next day. The second morning, we went back out to hunt the same area. We started in the same general place. The plan was almost identical. Walk south along the western bank of the creek, cover ground, look for hogs, and stay aware of where we were. Because of what happened the day before, the creek was already on my mind. I remember paying more attention to it. I remember thinking about the power lines and how strange it had been to find ourselves on the wrong side. I remember looking at the bank and thinking how impossible it would have been to cross without remembering. The creek was still the same. Deep bed, narrow water, steep drop, no casual way across. We started south on the western side again. At first, everything was normal. The sun was up. The woods were waking slowly. We moved through the palmettos, checking likely cover, listening for movement, and keeping the creek nearby as our guide. We had been walking for a while when we saw two other hunters posted up in trees. They were on the western bank. They had found a place to sit and wait, likely watching an area where hogs might pass through. Their orange clothing made them easy enough to identify once we noticed them, and we immediately decided we should give them space. You do not want to interfere with other hunters. You do not want to cross into someone else's setup, especially in thick woods where visibility is limited. We had no reason to crowd them or push game toward them. So we decided to cross the creek intentionally and move along the eastern bank instead. This time, there was no confusion. We found a safe place. We climbed down into the creek bed. We crossed the water. We climbed back up onto the eastern side. Both of us knew exactly where we were. The other hunters remained behind us on the western bank. The cars were also on that side, farther north. We were now on the eastern bank, moving south to avoid interfering with the hunters. My buddy and I continued along the creek for a little while. Then he noticed a small patch of thicker woods off to one side and decided to investigate it. It looked like the kind of place hogs might bed down or move through. The brush was dense enough that you could not easily see into it, and there were probably signs of disturbed ground or a trail that caught his attention. He told me he was going to check it out. I told him I would keep walking south along the creek and wait if I got too far ahead. That was the plan. He stepped off toward the thicker patch. I continued south. I was not moving quickly. I was just walking the creek line, staying on the eastern side, scanning the ground and brush as I went. The creek remained near me. I knew exactly which side I was on. I had crossed only a few minutes earlier, deliberately and with full awareness. Then, within about a minute, my walkie-talkie crackled. It was my buddy. His voice sounded confused. Hey bud, he said. Where are you going? I answered normally. Down the creek, I said. I'll wait for you if I get too far ahead. There was a short pause. Then he said, Okay, but what are you doing over there? Why'd you cross back over the creek? I stopped walking. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. What do you mean? I said. I didn't cross back. He told me I was on the western side again. The side where we had started. The side with the cars. The side where the two other hunters were posted in the trees. I told him that was impossible. I had crossed with him. I had watched him climb down the bank. I had crossed the water. I had climbed up the eastern side. I had been walking south on the eastern bank ever since. There was no way I had crossed back. But he insisted. He could see me. I could not see him because the brush was too thick and the terrain blocked my view, but he could see through an opening well enough to identify exactly where I was. He said I was on the western bank, not just somewhere close to the creek, not somewhere uncertain. I was on the wrong side. I was right between the two hunters we had crossed the creek to avoid. I remember feeling my stomach drop. I looked around immediately. The woods around me looked normal, but suddenly I could not trust them. I could hear the creek nearby, but I could not see enough of it through the brush to prove where I was. The palmettos, trees, and uneven ground all looked like they could belong to either side. I checked my position. I tried to remember every step I had taken since my buddy went toward the thick woods. I had walked south. That was all. I had not gone down a bank. I had not jumped across water. I had not climbed anything. I had not even seen a crossing point. I had just kept walking. But he was telling me I was back on the western side. We argued about it over the walkie-talkie for a few seconds, not angrily, more like two people trying to force reality into a shape that made sense. I haven't crossed, I said. You're definitely on the other side, he said. I'm on the east bank, I told him. No, he said. You're on the west bank. I can see you. I did not know what to do. I could not see him from where I was, but he could see me. He knew the terrain. He had just watched where I was moving from a different angle. If he was right, then something had happened that I had no memory of. I finally told him I would stay where I was. Fine, I said. I'll stay put. You come to me. He agreed. I stood still. I did not move. I did not want to make the situation worse. I did not want to walk farther and somehow get more confused. I was already trying to understand how I could possibly be on the opposite side of a deep creek without crossing it. The woods became very quiet. I remember listening for him. At first, I heard nothing but the normal sounds of the area, faint movement in brush, distant birds, the sound of water somewhere below, the small noises that happen in Florida woods when you stand still long enough. Then I heard movement, not far away, branches shifting, brush being pushed aside. Footsteps. I looked toward the sound. Through the trees and palmettos, I saw the bright orange of my buddy's hat. It came into view slowly. He was moving toward me from the other side of the creek. Then I watched him cross. I watched him climb down into the creek bed. I watched him make his way over the water. I watched him climb up the bank toward me. There was no doubt in my mind that he crossed the creek to reach me. I saw the whole thing. When he reached me, he looked at me with the same confused expression I probably had on my face. Then we walked out of the woods together, and he was right. I was on the western side. I was exactly where he said I was. I was between the two other hunters in the trees, back on the bank we had started from that morning. The western bank. The side with the cars. The side we had intentionally left only minutes earlier. I stood there looking around, trying to find some way to explain it. The two hunters were where they had been. The creek was where it had always been. My buddy had crossed the creek to get to me, and I had somehow ended up on the wrong side without remembering a crossing. There was no question that I had been on the eastern side after we crossed to avoid the hunters. We had both crossed together. There was no question that my buddy had gone into the thick woods on the eastern side, while I continued south. There was no question that I had told him I was walking down the creek on that same eastern bank. And there was no question that he had seen me on the western side. I could not explain it. I still cannot. We tried to make sense of it afterward. Maybe I had crossed at a spot where the creek bed was less obvious, but I had not. There was no shallow little path I could have taken without knowing. The creek was too deep. The banks were too steep. Even if I found a narrow point in the water, I would still have had to climb down and back up. There was no way to cross without putting effort into it, and I would have remembered. Maybe I had somehow walked around a bend in the creek. Maybe the creek curved so sharply that the bank changed sides around me without me recognizing it. That seemed possible in theory, but it did not match the terrain or the way we had been moving. The creek ran mostly north to south. We had been following it south. The whole point of the route was that the creek acted as a dividing line. For me to end up on the western side, I would have had to cross it, or somehow walk around a major bend that neither of us had noticed. But my buddy had been watching my location. He saw me where I should not have been. Maybe I had become disoriented and crossed without remembering. That was the explanation I wanted to believe most, because it was the only one that fit the world as I understand it. Maybe I had been so focused on the brush, ground, and hunting that I crossed automatically. Maybe I used a place where the banks were easier. Maybe I climbed down, crossed, and climbed back up while my mind was somewhere else. But again, the creek was not something you crossed casually. It was too physically demanding. It was too obvious. And I had no memory of wet feet, dirt on my clothes, climbing down, jumping water, or pulling myself up the far side. Nothing. I had simply walked south. Then my buddy called me on the radio and told me I was somewhere impossible. The first day made the whole thing worse. On day one, both of us had somehow found ourselves on the eastern side when we believed we had stayed on the western side. We could at least blame that on getting turned around. We had been hunting for hours. We had been walking through similar terrain. Maybe we crossed without remembering. Maybe the creek bent around us. Maybe we made a mistake. But on day two, the situation was clearer. We had deliberately crossed from west to east to avoid the two hunters. My buddy had gone into a patch of thick woods. I had walked south for less than a minute. Then he saw me back on the western side. Not only that, but he had to cross the creek again to reach me. He physically crossed the barrier I had apparently crossed without knowing. I watched him do it. There was no illusion in that. There was no uncertainty about which bank he came from. The creek was below him. The water was between us. Then he climbed up beside me. We were both standing on the western bank afterward. I have hunted enough and spent enough time outdoors to know that people can become turned around easily. Forests can make directions confusing. Thick brush can conceal landmarks. A person can become certain they are moving in a straight line when they are actually drifting left or right. The sun can change. The ground can slope. A creek can bend. A trail can disappear. I understand all of that. And I am not saying I know what happened. Maybe we made a navigational error both days. Maybe there was some weird bend in the creek that neither of us understood in the moment. Maybe I crossed somewhere without realizing it. Maybe the stress of hunting, navigating, and watching the terrain created a gap in my memory. There may be a perfectly normal explanation, but I have never found one that satisfies me, because the creek was too memorable. It was too deep. It was too difficult. It was not a little ditch you could hop over while distracted. It was a serious obstacle in the landscape. Crossing it involved a descent, water, and a climb. You had to look for a suitable place. You had to make a decision to do it. You could not just drift across it. Yet twice in 2 days, the creek seemed to place us on its opposite bank. The first time, both of us ended up across from our cars without remembering the crossing. The second time, I ended up back on the western side, while my buddy was still on the eastern side, even though I had not crossed after we separated. The second time is the one I cannot get past. The walkie-talkie conversation still plays in my mind. "Where are you going?" "Down the creek." "Why'd you cross back over?" "I didn't. You're on the other side." Then the sound of my buddy moving through the woods, the flash of his orange hat, watching him climb down into the creek bed, watching him cross the water, watching him come up the bank toward me, then walking out together, and realizing he had been right all along. I had been standing on the western side. I was back where I had started. I do not know whether the creek was deceptive, whether the terrain did something strange to our sense of direction, or whether we simply made mistakes we could not recognize. But I know I did not feel myself cross it. I know I did not remember climbing into the creek bed. And I know that in those Florida woods, the creek became more than a landmark. It became the one thing I could no longer trust, because I will never be able to explain the creek that kept putting people on the opposite bank without them ever stepping over it. When my partner and I decided to move in together, neither of us had much money to spare. We were both working, both trying to save, and both knew that finding a bigger place right away would be difficult. At the time, she was renting a small bungalow that had been built sometime in the 1920s. It was cheap enough that it made sense for me to move in with her rather than immediately take on a more expensive apartment or house. The plan was simple. I would move into the bungalow with her. We would split expenses, save what we could, and eventually find somewhere bigger and newer. We knew the place was not perfect, but it was affordable, and that mattered more than anything else at the time. The bungalow was small, but it had more usable space than it first appeared to. The upstairs was where we spent most of our time. It had the living room, kitchen, bedrooms, and the parts of the house that felt most normal and lived in. It was old, but comfortable enough. The floors creaked in places, the walls were a little uneven, and the layout had that slightly awkward feeling old houses often have, where rooms seem to have been changed or added onto over the decades. Then there was the basement. The basement had once been its own separate unit, or at least had been set up to function like one. At some point in the past, someone had tried to make it a small, independent living space. It had a bathroom, a laundry area, and enough open room that you could imagine someone once living down there. But by the time we were renting the bungalow, the basement had fallen into disrepair. The landlords had not wanted to spend money fixing the various problems. There were foundation leaks. There were issues with moisture. Parts of it felt unfinished or neglected. It was not somewhere you would want to use as a proper bedroom or apartment, but it was still available to us as part of the rental. The small washroom in the basement still worked. That was important. It was not a nice bathroom. It was basic, old, and a little strange. It had a sink, a toilet, and whatever simple fixtures had survived from when the basement had been used as a separate unit. There was no proper door leading into it, which meant you could hear almost everything happening inside from the larger basement space. If water was running in the sink, you would know. If someone flushed the toilet, you would know. If a pipe knocked, you would know. There was no hiding any sound down there. When I moved in, I brought my gaming consoles with me. Because the upstairs living room was where we spent most of our time together, I did not want to take it over whenever I wanted to play games. I thought it would be better to set up downstairs. That way, I could have my own space, and my partner could still relax upstairs without having to listen to whatever game I was playing. The basement was not particularly cozy, but it worked. I set up a television, my consoles, a chair, and whatever else I needed. The open area near the laundry space became my gaming area. It was separate enough from the rest of the house that I could disappear down there for a few hours without bothering anyone. At the time, my partner and I worked different hours. That meant there were plenty of times when we were not home together. Sometimes she would be at work while I had time off. Sometimes I would be out while she was home. Sometimes one of us would come home late while the other had already gone to bed. Because of that, I often had the basement to myself. Whenever I had free time and nothing else to do, I would go downstairs, turn on the console, and spend a while playing games. I liked having that space. Even though the basement was old and a little damp, it felt like mine. It was quiet. It was out of the way. It let us both have room in a house that otherwise felt small. The strange thing began during the first month or so after I moved in. It did not happen every day. It did not happen every time I went downstairs. But it happened often enough that I noticed. Maybe 4 or 5 times in the first month, I would go down to the basement and find the small washroom sink running. Not full blast. Not flooding the sink. Not spraying water everywhere. Just a steady, constant stream. The tap would be open enough that water ran into the basin without stopping. It was not a drip. It was not the occasional slow leak you might expect from an old faucet. It was a proper stream, as if someone had washed their hands and forgotten to turn the handle all the way off. The first time it happened, I did not think much about it. I assumed my partner had been downstairs earlier and had forgotten to shut the tap completely after using the washroom. That seemed a little odd, because she was generally not careless about things like that. But everyone forgets something occasionally. I turned it off and went about my day. The second time, I had the same thought. Maybe she had used the bathroom before leaving for work. Maybe she had come downstairs to do laundry, washed her hands, and been distracted by something upstairs. Maybe she had been in a hurry. The basement bathroom was not somewhere either of us used often, but it was functional. It would not have been impossible for her to go down there for some reason. So again, I turned the tap off. I kept meaning to bring it up. Every time I found the sink running, I would think I should ask her about this later. Then I would get distracted. We would talk about work, dinner, bills, plans, or whatever else was going on. The running faucet was never important enough to become a serious conversation. It was just one of those small household things you assume has a simple explanation. The house was old. The basement was old. Maybe the faucet was loose. Maybe the handle did not close properly. Maybe the water pressure was doing something strange. But there was something about it that did not quite fit. The sink tap was not slowly leaking. It was open. There is a difference. A leak is something you expect from old plumbing. A slow drip can come from a worn washer, a bad valve, old seals, or a faucet that does not close perfectly anymore. But this looked as though someone had physically turned the handle. The tap was on, then I would turn it off, and later it would be on again. Still, I assumed it was my partner. I did not accuse her of anything. I did not even think it was worth mentioning at first. It seemed too small and too ordinary. In a relationship, There are always little things you assume the other person did. Someone leaves a cupboard open. Someone forgets a dish in the sink. Someone does not turn off a light. Someone leaves the bathroom tap running. It did not feel mysterious. It just felt mildly annoying. And because our schedules were so different, we often had no way of knowing exactly when the other person had been in a particular room. Maybe she had gone downstairs while I was out. Maybe I had missed her coming back up. Maybe she had used the bathroom and forgotten the tap without realizing it. So I kept turning it off and forgetting to ask. Then one day, the explanation disappeared. I was downstairs playing games. It was one of those ordinary days where nothing felt strange. I had gone down to the basement, settled into my chair, turned on my console, and started playing. The television light flickered across the walls. The laundry area was behind or beside me. The small washroom was nearby, open to the basement, because there was no door separating it from the main area. I could hear everything in that bathroom from where I sat. The basement was quiet except for the sound of my game. At some point, my partner came home. I heard her come into the house upstairs. Maybe I heard the front door, maybe footsteps, maybe her voice calling down. Eventually, she came downstairs to say hi. That was normal. We often checked in with each other when one of us got home. She came down to the basement, and we started talking while I was still at my gaming setup. We talked about her day. I probably told her what I had been doing. We were just catching up, standing or sitting in that old basement, as though it was any other evening. Then, somehow, the conversation turned to the sink. I do not remember exactly which of us brought it up first. Maybe she casually asked why I kept leaving the basement washroom tap open. Maybe she had noticed it several times and thought I had been doing it. Maybe she had gone downstairs before and found water running after I had been using the basement. Whatever the exact wording was, she asked me why I kept leaving the sink running. I remember being confused immediately. I said something like, "What do you mean? I thought you were doing that." That was the moment the whole thing became strange. We both looked at each other. At first, it was not an argument. Neither of us was angry. It was more like that uncomfortable moment when two people realize they have been making the same assumption about each other for weeks. She thought I had been leaving the tap on. I thought she had been leaving the tap on. Neither of us had actually done it. We began comparing details. How many times had she found it running? How often had I found it? Had either of us used the bathroom recently before discovering it? Was the sink tap loose? Could water pressure somehow move the handle? Could the old plumbing cause it to open by itself? We were standing there, talking through it, both slightly amused but also confused. Then the sink tap opened, right beside us. There was no delay, no warning, no slow drip, no movement from either of us. The faucet handle shifted, and water began running into the sink. A steady stream, exactly like the times we had both assumed the other person had left it on. For a second, neither of us said anything. We just stared. Both our jaws dropped. It is one thing to tell a story about a faucet being left on in an old basement. It is easy to dismiss that. It is easy to say someone forgot. It is easy to say the faucet was loose or the valve was faulty. But standing a few feet away from it, while it opened by itself, was different. The water ran loudly in the quiet basement. The sound filled the small washroom and echoed slightly against the old walls. My partner moved first. She immediately went over to inspect it. At that point, I should mention that she had a journeyperson ticket in plumbing. She was not an expert on every possible plumbing issue in the world, but she knew more about fixtures, valves, water pressure, and ordinary failures than I did. She knew what a faucet should and should not do. She checked the tap. She looked at the handle. She checked how it had opened. She turned it off and tested it. She looked for looseness, obvious damage, or anything that might explain why the water had started running. But there was nothing obvious. The valve was not visibly failing. The faucet did not seem to have the kind of problem that would cause it to slowly creep open. There was no drip when it was closed, no steady pressure forcing water through, no broken handle that slipped down on its own, no obvious issue that made us say, "Oh, that is it. That is why it keeps happening." That was what made the moment stick with us. I am not saying there could not have been a rational explanation. Old plumbing can behave strangely. Parts wear out, water pressure changes. A valve can have an internal issue that is not obvious from the outside. A faucet handle can loosen in a way that does not happen every time. Temperature changes can affect metal. Vibration from pipes or the building might have played a role. There could have been something we did not see. But the way it happened felt wrong. The faucet did not simply start dripping. It did not make a noise and then leak. It opened, and it opened while we were literally talking about whether either of us had been responsible for it. That timing was impossible to ignore. My partner kept investigating. She examined the faucet more carefully. She tested the handle again. She probably thought through every normal plumbing explanation she knew. If there had been a mechanical failure obvious enough to explain it, she would have found it, but she could not give me one. That did not mean there was no explanation. It only meant we did not have one. After that, the sink never did it again. That was another strange part. The faucet had been opening every so often during the first month or so after I moved in. It had happened enough times that both of us had quietly blamed the other without discussing it. Then, on the one occasion when we were both standing there and openly questioning it, the tap opened by itself, and after that, it stopped. Completely, we stayed in that bungalow for several more years. The basement remained my gaming area. The washroom remained there, old and functional. The sink remained there. But the tap never turned itself on again. Not once. There were no more unexplained streams of water. No more times when one of us came downstairs and assumed the other had forgotten to shut it off. No more moments when we heard water running in the open basement bathroom. It was just over. Eventually, we moved out. A friend of ours took over the rental agreement after us. He lived there for another 4 years or so. We knew him well enough that he would have told us if something strange happened. He knew about the sink story, and he knew the basement had been where I set up my games. But nothing like that ever happened to him. The tap never opened by itself for him. No strange water running in the basement. No unexplained bathroom sounds. No repeated issue with the fixture. The house did not develop some ongoing haunted reputation. It was just that one strange period while we were there. And it was limited to that one tap. I still think about it sometimes, because it is not the kind of story that has a dramatic ending. No shadow figure appeared. No voice spoke from the bathroom. No doors slammed. No one got hurt. It was only a faucet, a simple old sink in a neglected basement bathroom. But it is often the smallest things that stay with you. You hear water running when you know no one should be in the room. You assume your partner forgot. Your partner assumes you forgot. Weeks pass. Then one day, while you are both standing nearby talking about it, the tap opens on its own. And suddenly, the easy explanation is gone. The strangest part is that neither of us became convinced it was supernatural. We did not decide that the bungalow was haunted. We did not start looking for ghost stories about the property. We did not begin treating every sound in the basement as proof that something was there. The house was old. The basement was damp. The plumbing was not perfect. There were plenty of normal reasons to suspect a mechanical issue. But even years later, we still do not know what that issue would have been. My partner had plumbing experience. She checked the faucet. She knew that a valve failure would normally show some sign. A damaged fixture would usually drip, leak, become loose, or misbehave more consistently. This faucet did none of that. It simply turned on occasionally. Then it turned on in front of both of us. Then it never did it again. Maybe the old building settled in a particular way and moved the handle. Maybe water pressure briefly changed at just the right moment. Maybe the fixture had a hidden defect that corrected itself after being used or inspected. Maybe something in the pipes vibrated enough to shift it. Maybe there was some explanation that neither of us thought of. That is entirely possible, but I cannot shake the timing. For weeks, the water would be running when one of us entered the basement alone. Neither of us knew the other had been seeing the same thing. Then we finally compared stories, and right as we began asking each other who had been leaving it on, the faucet made the choice for us. It opened. We were both there. We both saw it, and neither of us had touched it. That was the last time it ever happened. Before the next witness speaks, take a second to subscribe to the Blackout Witness. New stories are shared here for the quiet hours, when the house is dark, the phone is face down, and every small sound feels louder than it should. A like and a comment help the channel reach more people who enjoy real stories with no easy answers. Now, let's go back to the night everything went dark. My sister was 3 at the time, and we were being babysat by one of my mum's friends. I do not remember every detail about her apartment now, but I remember enough of the layout to know what happened did not make sense. It was a normal morning at first. My sister and I were in the kitchen with our babysitter while she made us breakfast. The apartment had that quiet, early day feeling. There was food being prepared, plates being set out, and the usual small noises of someone moving around a kitchen. I remember being close to my sister because we were both still little, and when you are that young, being in someone else's home without your parents can make you stay near each other without even thinking about it. Our babysitter had a baby of her own. The baby was only a few months old, somewhere between 3 and 5 months, as far as I remember. The baby was sleeping in another room in a deep crib. It was not the kind of crib where an older child could easily reach in and pick the baby up. The sides were high enough that an adult had to lower the railing to properly reach inside. I remember that detail because it became important later. The crib was deep. The baby was small, and nobody else was in the apartment except the babysitter, my sister, and me. The baby had been asleep while we were in the kitchen. Our babysitter was setting plates on the table. She was probably trying to get breakfast ready for all of us before the baby woke up. I remember the feeling of waiting for food, watching her move around, and hearing my sister nearby. Then the baby screamed. It was not a normal little cry. It was sharp and sudden, the kind of scream that makes every adult react immediately. Our babysitter dropped what she was doing and ran towards the baby's room. My sister and I followed right behind her. We were scared because the scream had sounded wrong. Even as little kids, we knew the difference between a baby fussing and a baby making a sound that caused adults to panic. We reached the room. The crib was there, exactly where it should have been. Nothing looked knocked over, nothing looked broken. The room did not look disturbed. But the baby had gone quiet, and the baby was gone. I remember the crib being empty. I remember our babysitter staring at it for a second, as if her mind could not understand what she was seeing. The railing had not been lowered. The crib itself looked untouched. There was no sign that anyone had come into the room, No open window, no obvious way for the baby to have moved, and no adult standing there holding her. The baby was simply not in the crib. At 5 years old, I did not have the words to understand how serious that was. I only knew that our babysitter suddenly looked terrified. She started looking around the room. She checked the floor beside the crib. She looked behind furniture. She looked under things. My sister and I stood close together, frightened and confused, because the baby had been there only moments before. We had heard her scream, and now she was gone. The apartment felt very quiet. The kitchen noises had stopped. There was no television playing, no voices from another room, no sound of a front door opening or closing, just the babysitter moving quickly around the nursery, trying to find her child. Then we heard another scream. This time it came from the babysitter's own room. Everyone froze for half a second. Then she ran again. My sister and I followed because we were too scared to be left behind. When we reached her bedroom, the room looked wrong. There were things from under the bed piled on top of the bed. I remember that clearly. Items that should have been hidden beneath the bed had somehow been stacked above it. It was not just one thing that had been pulled out. There were several things arranged or piled on the mattress where they did not belong, and somewhere under those things, toward the middle of the bed, the babysitter found the baby. The baby was still wrapped tightly in her blanket. She was alive. She was quiet by then, but she had been crying moments earlier. The babysitter grabbed her immediately. I remember the fear in the room, more than I remember what anyone said. I remember my sister being close to me. I remember adults moving quickly. I remember the baby being held tightly. I remember feeling like something had happened that none of us understood. The crib was in a separate room. The baby had been sleeping inside it. The sides were high. The railing had not been lowered. Nobody else had been in the apartment. Yet somehow, the baby had ended up in the babysitter's bedroom, on the middle of the bed, still wrapped in her blanket, beneath a pile of things that had been taken from under the bed. Even now, I cannot make sense of it. I have tried to think of ordinary explanations over the years. Maybe someone had been in the apartment and we did not know it. Maybe the babysitter had moved the baby herself and had a moment of confusion because she was exhausted. Maybe the baby had somehow been placed on the bed before we even entered the kitchen and the memory became mixed up later. But that does not fit the way everyone reacted. The babysitter had heard the baby scream from the crib room. She ran toward that room. My sister and I followed her. The crib was empty. Then we heard the baby scream from her bedroom. There was no time for someone to calmly move the baby from one place to the other. There was no one else there. I was only 5, so I understand that childhood memory can be unreliable. I know memories can shift over time. Details can become more dramatic without someone meaning to change them. But the main part of that morning never faded for me. A baby screamed from a deep crib. We ran to the room. The crib was empty. Then the baby screamed from another bedroom, and we found her on the bed, tightly wrapped, beneath items that had not been there before. That was the first time I remember feeling the kind of fear that does not go away when you turn on a light. It was not the fear of a nightmare. It was not the fear of being told a ghost story. It was the fear of watching adults become afraid. When you are a small child, adults are supposed to know what to do. They are supposed to explain things. They are supposed to tell you that everything is okay. But that morning, nobody had an explanation. The babysitter found her baby. The baby was safe. That was what mattered most. But the question of how she got there stayed behind. Years later, when I was 19, I had another experience that was completely different, but just as difficult to explain. I was home alone. I was in college at the time, and I had only one class scheduled that day. It had been canceled, so I suddenly had the house to myself and nothing urgent to do. It was an ordinary day. Nothing felt strange when it started. I was in my room playing Minecraft. I remember that detail because it made the entire thing feel even more surreal. I was doing something completely normal and relaxing. I was sitting in my room, focused on a game, probably half listening to the sounds of the house around me without paying much attention to them. Then the walls started shaking. At first, I thought something heavy had hit the house. The sound was loud and deep. It was not a small knock on the front door. It was not a neighbor doing yard work. It was not a truck passing outside. It sounded like someone was pounding against the walls from the other side. Hard, repeatedly, the noise echoed through the entire house. The walls around me seemed to vibrate. I could feel the sound in the room, not just hear it. It was like heavy blows were landing against different parts of the house at once. Thump, thump, thump. The first few impacts made me stop playing immediately. I pulled my headphones off or muted the game and listened. The pounding continued. It was not coming from one clear location. That was what made it so unnerving. It sounded as if the house itself was being hit from outside. One wall would seem to shake, then another. The noise echoed upstairs and downstairs. It was loud enough that it felt impossible for anyone nearby not to notice. I stood up and looked around my room. Nothing had fallen. The windows were still closed. The door was open, but the walls were shaking. The sound continued. For a second, I wondered if there had been an earthquake, but it did not feel like the ground was moving. It felt like something was striking the house. Violently, repeatedly, I went out into the hallway. The thumping was louder there. I tried to locate it. Was it coming from the front of the house? The back? The side? The attic? The basement? Every time I thought I had identified one direction, the sound seemed to come from somewhere else. It echoed through the structure in a way that made it impossible to understand. I checked the upstairs rooms first. I went from room to room, looking at the windows and listening near the walls. I expected to find something obvious. Maybe a tree branch had fallen against the house. Maybe construction was happening nearby. Maybe somebody was using heavy equipment outside. Maybe an animal had gotten trapped somewhere. But nothing made sense. The windows were fine. There were no people outside that I could see. There was no storm, no strong wind, no visible damage. Still, the pounding continued. It sounded like a person, or several people, were hitting the walls from the outside with their fists or something heavier. I went downstairs. The noise followed. It echoed down the hallway, through the living room, and into the kitchen. I checked the front door. I looked through windows. I walked near the walls, trying to see if there was any vibration coming from a particular side of the house. Nothing. The entire house felt wrong. The walls seemed to shake with each thump, and every door frame seemed to tremble slightly. I could not understand how something that loud could be happening without a clear source. Then the doors slammed shut. The doors I had left open all closed at once. Not slowly, not because of a light draft. They slammed. The sound of the doors hitting their frames cut through the pounding, and that was the moment I stopped trying to investigate. I did not wait to find a better explanation. I did not stay in the house to see whether the noise would stop. I grabbed what I needed and went outside. I sat in the driveway for 2 hours waiting for someone else to come home. I remember being afraid to go back inside. The house was right there in front of me, looking completely normal. The windows were still. The roof looked fine. The driveway was quiet. Nothing outside suggested that anything had happened. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. And I knew I had watched open doors slam shut while the walls shook around me. For those 2 hours, I stayed in the driveway and waited. I kept listening for the pounding to start again. I watched the house. I watched the doors and windows. I probably checked my phone repeatedly, wondering when someone would be home. I did not want to be alone inside again. I did not want to walk back through those rooms while the sound was still happening. Eventually, the noise stopped. There was no dramatic ending, no police came, no neighbors ran over, no one found a broken wall, a fallen tree, or a damaged pipe. By the time someone came home, the house was silent again. It looked completely normal. That was almost worse. If there had been a clear cause, I could have accepted it. A storm, a tree branch, a damaged furnace, a burst pipe, a construction crew, a large animal in the attic. Anything, but there was nothing obvious. And the strangest part was that it never happened again. We lived in that house for another 4 years. 4 more years of normal days, normal nights. Doors opening and closing like doors should, walls standing still, and no unexplained pounding shaking the house from every direction. I recorded a few seconds of the sound while it was happening. Not much. Just a short recording of the pounding. I still have the memory of making it, because I think part of me wanted proof. I wanted to be able to show someone that I was not imagining it. I wanted there to be evidence of what I heard, even if it did not capture the way the walls felt when they were vibrating around me. But a recording cannot capture everything. It cannot capture the fear of standing alone in a house while every wall seems to be taking blows from the other side. It cannot capture how confusing it was to walk through every room and find nothing. It cannot capture the sudden sound of every open door slamming shut. And it cannot capture the helpless feeling of realizing that you do not know what to do except leave. I have considered practical explanations. Maybe there was a strong pressure change in the house that caused doors to slam. Maybe wind was hitting the structure in some unusual way, even if it did not seem windy outside. Maybe there was an issue with the heating or air system that created vibrations through the walls. Maybe something in the attic or crawl space shifted. Maybe a nearby construction event or heavy vehicle created vibrations that sounded much closer than they were. Maybe someone outside was doing something that I never saw. All of those are possible. But none of them explain the full experience for me. The pounding was everywhere. The walls felt as if they were being struck. The noise echoed through the entire house. And then the doors closed all at once. It was not an experience that made me decide I knew what ghosts were. I still do not know. The babysitting incident from when I was 5 and the house-shaking incident from when I was 19 were completely different. One involved a baby appearing in a different room under impossible circumstances. The other involved a house behaving as though something outside was trying to get in. Neither event gave me a clear answer, but both changed the way I think about unexplained things. I do not automatically assume everything is paranormal. There are plenty of times when a strange sound turns out to be plumbing, weather, wiring, an animal, or something ordinary people simply did not notice at first. But I also know there are moments when you have already checked the obvious things. You have looked through every room. You have listened for where the sound is coming from. You have checked the doors, windows, walls, and surroundings, and you are still left with nothing. The baby was safe. That is what matters most about the first story. But I still do not understand how she could have gone from a deep crib in one room to the middle of a bed in another room, wrapped tightly in her blanket, while only a babysitter and 2 small children were in the apartment. The house was not damaged. That is what matters most about the second story. But I still do not understand what could have made every wall shake as though something was pounding against them, then cause every open door to slam shut at once. Maybe there are explanations. Maybe there always are, but I have never found them. And even now, those 2 memories remain the scariest things I have experienced, because in both cases I was there, I heard what happened, I saw the aftermath, and I still have no idea what could have caused it. My mom has told this story for as long as I can remember, and she has never changed it. She does not tell it like a joke. She does not tell it to get attention. She does not tell it with the kind of smile people have when they are waiting to see whether you believe them. Whenever it comes up, she tells it seriously, with the same details she has always given. It happened in the early 1990s, when she was 27 years old, pregnant with my older brother, and living in Chihuahua, Mexico. At the time, my parents lived in a normal home. Nothing about the house was supposed to be frightening. It was just where they lived. They had their routines, their neighbors, their daily responsibilities, and a cat that my mom cared about deeply. The cat had a habit of wandering around, as cats often do. It might disappear into another room, sneak outside, sit somewhere hidden, or ignore every call until it decided it was ready to come back. But on the day this happened, my mom had been looking for her cat for a while and could not find her anywhere. She checked inside first. She looked through the rooms, under furniture, behind doors, and in the places where a cat might hide when it wanted to be left alone. She called for her again and again. She listened for the sound of paws on the floor, a faint meow, or anything that might tell her where the cat had gone. Nothing. Eventually, she went outside. The day was normal as far as she remembered. There had been no storm, no strange weather, no loud commotion in the neighborhood, and no reason to expect anything unusual. She was simply trying to find a missing cat. She stepped outside and began calling for her. At first, she looked around the yard, then along the side of the house, then toward the roof line, and that was when she saw it. There was something perched on the roof of the house. At first, her mind could not make sense of it. It was large, far too large to be a bird, far too large to be a cat, a dog, or any animal she could name. She estimated that it was about the size of a car. It was red. Not a small flash of red like a piece of cloth caught in the wind. Not a brief glimpse of sunlight reflecting off something on the roof. It was a large, solid red shape, sitting above the house in a way that made no sense. The creature looked like a dragon. That is the word she has always used, because she does not know what else to call it. It had a body large enough that she could clearly see its shape against the sky. It had wings. It had scales. It did not look like something made of shadow or cloud. It did not look like a trick of light that vanished when she blinked. It looked physical. It looked real, and it was sitting on the roof of the house. My mom said that for a few seconds, she simply stood there. She was still calling for the cat when she noticed it, but the words must have died in her throat. Her entire body froze. She could see the creature above her, perched in a way that made it seem heavy enough to crush part of the roof if it shifted its weight. She described it as red, dragon-like, covered in scales, and huge. Not enormous in the sense of a monster from a movie that fills the sky, but large enough that there was no way to mistake it for a normal animal. Its body was about as big as a car, at least from what she could tell while looking up at it. The wings were one of the details she remembered most clearly. They were not flapping wildly. They moved slowly. That was what made the sight feel even stranger to her. If something that large had wings, she expected the air to roar around it. She expected the roof to shake. She expected noise, wind, dust, anything. But she said it moved its wings slowly for something that size. Almost deliberately. She could see the scales on its body. She could see its wings lift and move. Then the creature took off. It rose from the roof and flew away. My mom did not stand there trying to get a better look. She did not follow it. She did not stop to wonder whether it was some kind of large bird. She panicked. She ran inside the house as fast as she could. My dad was in the shower at the time. My mom was terrified and yelling for him, trying to explain what she had just seen. She wanted him to come outside immediately. She wanted someone else to look. She wanted proof that she had not imagined it. But by the time anyone could have gone outside, there was nothing there. No creature. No red shape on the roof. No wings. No sign that something enormous had been perched above the house. And of course, nobody believed her. That is the part of the story that has probably followed her for the rest of her life. She knew how unbelievable it sounded. A pregnant woman in Chihuahua sees a red dragon-like creature sitting on the roof of her house, then watches it fly away. It sounds impossible. It sounds like a dream, a hallucination, a misunderstanding, or something a person might invent because they enjoy strange stories. But my mom is not like that. She is not someone who lies for entertainment. She is not someone who makes up dramatic stories for attention. She was not drinking. She was not using drugs. She was pregnant with my older brother and had every reason to be careful about what she put into her body. She was living her normal life, looking after the house, looking for her cat, and then suddenly saw something that completely terrified her. That is why the story has always stayed with me. Not because I am fully convinced there was a literal dragon sitting on the roof. I do not know what I believe. I know how insane it sounds. I know that people can misidentify animals, especially when they are startled. I know shadows, light, distance, and fear can change how something looks. I know memories become sharper in some places and blurrier in others as the years pass. I know there are probably explanations. Maybe it was a large bird. Maybe it was something perched on the roof that looked completely different from the angle where she stood. Maybe it was an unusual shape against the sky, some object, fabric, debris, or even a reflection that her brain turned into something living. Maybe the stress of pregnancy, exhaustion, heat, or a moment of intense fear affected what she thought she saw. But none of those explanations are satisfying when you listen to the way she tells it. She does not describe a vague shape. She does not say she saw something weird. She says she saw scales. She says it was red. She says it had wings. She says it was about the size of a car. She says it was perched on the roof. And she says she watched it take off. The fact that she has held on to that memory for so long makes it difficult to dismiss completely. There are stories people tell once, then forget details from. There are memories that become funny over time, where someone says, "I thought I saw something strange," but it was probably nothing. This is not one of those stories. My mom has sworn by it for our entire lives. She does not claim to know what it was. She does not insist that everyone has to believe her, but she does not doubt that she saw something. That is the difference. She may understand that nobody else can make sense of it, but she remembers the fear too clearly to pretend it did not happen. I have tried to imagine what it must have felt like. She was 27. She was pregnant. She was outside alone, calling for her cat. The house was ordinary. The neighborhood was ordinary. It was probably one of those normal, quiet moments where you are focused on a small task and thinking about nothing unusual. Then she looked up, and there was something on the roof. Something that should not have been there. Something too big to explain. Something red, scaled, winged, and alive enough to lift itself into the air. Even if it was only a few seconds, those seconds would have been enough. Sometimes fear does not need a long encounter. Sometimes one clear image can stay with you forever. A shape in a hallway, a face at a window, a strange sound in an empty house, or, in my mom's case, a red creature on the roof that looked like something from a myth. The thing that makes the story especially strange is that she was not trying to find something unusual. She was looking for a cat. That is such a small, ordinary reason to step outside. She was not out at midnight in the wilderness. She was not telling ghost stories. She was not searching for strange creatures. She was not walking through a haunted building or visiting some place known for weird sightings. She was at home. She was trying to find her pet. Then her whole sense of reality changed in a moment. I have asked myself whether she could have mistaken some type of large bird for a dragon. There are birds with broad wings, strange silhouettes, and colors that can appear different in certain light. A bird perched on a roof can look larger than it is, especially if you are standing close to the house and looking upward. A bird taking off can seem enormous if it spreads its wings suddenly. But she did not describe a bird. She described something with scales. She described a body much larger than a bird should have been. She described it as car-sized. Maybe the size was distorted by fear. Maybe the roofline made it hard to judge distance. Maybe the creature was farther away than it appeared. Maybe it was sitting on another structure, not directly above her. That is possible. But in her memory, it was on the roof. Close enough to see. Close enough to see the texture of its body. Close enough that when it moved, she felt immediate danger. Then there is the question of pregnancy. People sometimes try to explain experiences like this by saying that pregnancy can cause vivid dreams, heightened emotions, exhaustion, stress, or unusual perceptions. But my mom was not asleep. She was outside. She was standing in her yard. She was actively looking for the cat and calling for her. She was awake. She was alert. And afterward, she knew what she had seen was impossible. That did not make her doubt the memory. It only made her afraid to talk about it because she knew people would think she was crazy. My dad did not believe her. Other people did not believe her. Most people who hear the story probably do not believe her. And honestly, I do not know if I believe it 100% either. I love my mom. I know she is not a liar. I know she was not trying to fool anyone. I know she has told this story with complete sincerity for years. But a dragon is a dragon. It is difficult to hear that story and not search for some other explanation. A strange bird, a visual illusion, a large object on the roof, a misremembered moment, a dreamlike state, something temporary that she interpreted through fear. Maybe there was a real physical explanation that none of us have thought of. Maybe there was some local animal or object that looked bizarre under the light that day. Maybe the cat had gone onto a roof and her attention was already focused upward, making her mind more likely to turn a confusing shape into a creature. Maybe she was looking toward the sun, and the brightness around the roofline created an image that seemed more detailed than it truly was. I do not know. But I also do not think it is fair to call her a liar. There is a difference between saying, "I do not know what happened," and saying, "That person is making it up." My mom has no reason to invent a story like that. It has not made her famous. It has not earned her anything. It has only made people look at her strangely. If she wanted attention, she could have chosen a much easier story. She could have said she heard a voice, saw a shadow, or felt something in the house. Instead, she has spent decades standing by a story so unbelievable that almost anyone would doubt it. That kind of certainty is what makes me pause. She does not get defensive when people question it. She does not try to convince everyone. She simply says what happened. She was looking for her cat. She went outside. She saw a red dragon-like creature perched on the roof. She saw it take off. Then she ran inside and called for my dad, and nobody believed her. There is also something strange about the way people react to stories like this. If someone sees a shadowy figure in an old house, people may say it was a ghost. If someone hears footsteps in an empty hallway, people may say it was a spirit. If someone sees an unknown animal in the woods, people may call it a cryptid. But when the story involves something as impossible as a dragon, People do not even try to explain it. They simply laugh. Maybe that is because dragons belong to myths, books, games, and old stories. They are not supposed to appear in real life. They are too deeply connected to imagination. But if someone truly saw something that looked like a dragon, what would they call it? They would use the only word they have. My mom did not say it had to be a literal creature from a fantasy story. She did not say it breathed fire. She did not say it spoke. She did not say it attacked anyone. She only said it looked like a dragon. Red, scaled, winged, large, perched, on the roof, then gone. Maybe the word dragon is the closest label for something she could not identify. Maybe it was some unfamiliar animal, a strange visual event, or an illusion so vivid that it became fixed in her memory as a creature. Maybe there is a completely rational explanation. But whatever the explanation was, it had enough presence to make her run inside in terror, and it stayed with her for more than 30 years. I think that is why I keep coming back to the story. It is not proof of dragons. It is not proof of anything supernatural. It is a story about someone I trust telling me something she cannot explain. A person who was sober, awake, pregnant, and simply trying to find her cat. A person who saw something so strange that it broke the normal rules of the world for a few seconds. Then she was left alone with the memory because nobody else saw it. Maybe that is the most frightening part. Not the creature itself, not the idea of scales or wings or red eyes on a rooftop, but the feeling of seeing something impossible and knowing that, by the time you get anyone else to look, it is gone. You are standing there with the memory. Your heart is racing. You know what you saw. Everyone around you tells you it could not have happened. And eventually, you are forced to live between two possibilities. Either the world is stranger than anyone realizes, or your own eyes betrayed you in the clearest, most unforgettable moment of your life. My mom has chosen to trust what she saw. I do not know whether I would make the same choice. But I know she is not lying. And I know that whenever she tells the story, she still sounds like the 27-year-old woman standing outside in Chihuahua, calling for her cat, looking up at the roof, and seeing something impossible looking back from above. I was invited to take part in a cleansing ritual of some kind when I was around 20 years old. This was about 34 years ago, back when I was playing in a rock band and spending a lot of time around people who were more openly interested in spiritual things than I was. I would not have described myself as deeply involved in any kind of occult practice, but I was open-minded enough that people sometimes assumed I was spiritual. At that age, people invited each other into strange situations without thinking too hard about them. Someone would say there was a gathering happening, or a reading, or a ritual meant to clear bad energy, and everyone would treat it as though it was normal. There was always a mixture of curiosity, youthful confidence, and the belief that nothing could truly be too serious because everyone knew one another. That was how I ended up there. The people involved were not strangers. I knew everyone in the room. They were connected through the band, friends, girlfriends, and the kind of social circle that forms around rehearsals, late-night conversations, gigs, and people hanging around after practice. The singer in the band had a girlfriend, and her mother was known to be a white witch. That was how people described her. She was not presented as someone dangerous or sinister. She was not someone claiming to worship dark forces or trying to frighten people. She was seen as someone who dealt with herbs, cleansing, rituals, spiritual protection, and whatever else people associate with that kind of practice. Still, even then, I was not sure what to make of it. I knew enough to understand that some people took it seriously. Others treated it as a strange but harmless thing. and some of us, including me, were somewhere in between. We did not know whether we believed in it, but we were curious enough to show up. The reason for the ritual was that the singer's girlfriend's mother believed she had been hexed, cursed, or had some kind of negative spiritual attachment placed on her. I never fully understood the details. I do not remember who was supposed to have placed the hex on her or why. I do not remember whether it was connected to a specific person, a conflict, or something that had happened earlier in her life. I only remember that she and the people close to her believed something was wrong. There had apparently been bad luck, unsettling feelings, strange events, or some kind of ongoing distress that they could not easily explain. Whether it was a literal hex or simply a way of describing a difficult period in her life, I cannot say. But everyone there acted as though the ritual mattered. The room itself was ordinary enough. It was not some dramatic stone chamber or hidden temple. It was a normal place where people had gathered, though the lighting and setup quickly made it feel different. Candles were brought out and placed around the room. They were lit one by one, and the regular shadows of the room changed as the flames began to flicker. The light became warmer. The corners of the room became darker. The faces of the people around me looked different in candlelight, more serious and less familiar. There may have been incense or herbs burning too. I remember a smell in the room, something earthy and sweet, but also smoky. It may have been candles, it may have been incense, or it may have been something else used for the ritual. Whatever it was, it made the air feel thicker. Everyone seemed quieter than usual. Normally, when that group of people got together, there was laughter, music, talking over one another, jokes, and somebody always telling a story too loudly. But that night, people seemed focused. There was a reason we were there. The candles were not decoration. The room was not being set up for a party. We were supposed to help. I remember feeling slightly out of place. I was young, and I had not done anything like this before. I did not know what I was meant to do, or whether I was expected to feel something. I did not know whether people would be watching each other for a reaction. Part of me worried that I would do something wrong. Another part of me wondered if it was all just theater. Then the ritual began. We joined hands. Everyone formed a circle around the woman at the center of the ritual. The singer, his girlfriend, other friends, and I stood with our hands linked. The candlelight flickered across the walls. The room became quiet, except for the sounds of breathing, faint movement, and the occasional crackle of a candle wick. The mother began speaking. I do not remember the exact words. I remember the tone more than the language. Her voice was low and steady, not theatrical, not shouted. She spoke as if she had done this before. She told us to close our eyes or focus inward. She told us to visualize moving through fog. That was the instruction. We were supposed to imagine a fog, a thick mist, a place where the room around us disappeared and we moved into something else. At first, I did what I thought everyone else was doing. I closed my eyes. I pictured a gray fog in front of me. It was nothing complicated. I imagined mist rolling across the ground. I imagined walking through it. I tried to follow along because I did not want to be the one person standing there thinking about what to eat later or wondering whether I looked foolish. The fog became clearer. At least it seemed to. It started as something I was deliberately picturing, but after a while it felt less like I was making it up. The room around me became less important. The warmth of the hands holding mine faded from my attention. The candlelight disappeared behind my closed eyes. All I could see was fog, not white fog. It was gray and thick, like early morning mist on a cold day. It moved around me in slow layers. I could not see far through it. The ground beneath me felt uneven, though I was still standing in the same place in the real room. I remember feeling as if I were walking. I do not know whether my body moved at all. I do not remember taking steps in the actual room. But in the vision, or imagination, or whatever it was, I was moving forward through the fog. The air felt cold. There was a smell of damp stone. Then the fog began to thin. I found myself somewhere that looked like a small monastery. That is the closest word I have for it. It was not enormous. It was not a grand cathedral with high ceilings and stained glass. It looked more like an old, isolated religious building. There were stone walls, dark corridors, open spaces that felt like a courtyard or chapel, and a sense that the place had been abandoned or damaged long ago. The architecture seemed old. Everything looked worn. The stone was darkened by age and moisture. Parts of the building looked ruined. Some walls were broken. The air was full of dust, smoke, fog, or something that made it hard to see clearly into the distance. There was no bright sunlight. The whole place had a gray, cold, early morning feeling. At first, I was only standing there. Then I realized I was not alone. One of the daughters was beside me. I knew her in real life. She was part of the group, connected to the singer and the mother, and she had been standing in the room during the ritual. But in this other place, she did not look exactly the way she did in ordinary life. She looked like a knight. And somehow, so did I. I remember having a sword. It was not a vague feeling of being armed. I could see it. I could feel its weight in my hand. The blade looked old, but sharp, bright in certain places despite the darkness around us. I had no idea how I had gone from standing in a circle holding hands to being in a ruined monastery with a sword. But the scene felt complete enough that I did not question it at first. The daughter had a sword too. We were standing side by side. Then figures began to come toward us. They looked like monks. At least, they wore dark robes like monks. Long black robes, hoods, and loose sleeves. But they had no faces. That was the most disturbing part. Where their faces should have been, there was only darkness. Not masks, not blank skin, not hidden features, just a black emptiness inside their hoods. They moved around the ruined monastery in a way that felt wrong. They did not rush in a normal human way. They seemed to glide or drift through the corridors and open spaces. Some came from doorways. Some appeared through the fog. Some stood farther back, watching. I remember feeling that they were hostile. Not necessarily because they attacked first, but because the entire place felt like a struggle. There was a sense that we were blocking them from reaching something or someone. The daughter beside me and I seemed to understand that without saying it aloud. We had to fight. So we did. I remember moving with the sword. I remember swinging it. I remember the feeling of trying to keep the black-robed figures away from us. I do not remember blood. I do not remember graphic violence. The experience was not like a movie battle where every detail is clear. It was more symbolic than that. The faceless monks came toward us, and we struck them down. When the blade hit them, they did not collapse like ordinary people. They seemed to dissolve, fold into shadow, or disappear into the gray fog around us. There was no clear physical aftermath, just the sense that each one was removed from the path. The daughter and I fought side by side. At some point, I noticed something else happening farther into the monastery. The singer and his girlfriend were there too. They were not fighting. They were working to free the mother. She was tied to a stone table inside what looked like a ruined chapel. I could see her from a distance, though the place seemed to shift around me. The chapel had broken walls and an old stone altar or table in the middle. The mother was restrained there, as if whatever had been placed on her had made her a prisoner in this place. The singer and his girlfriend were trying to untie her. They were pulling at knots, bindings, ropes, or strips of dark material. It was difficult to tell exactly what held her down, but I knew that was what they were doing. They were freeing her. The daughter and I were keeping the faceless monks away while they worked. That was the role we seemed to have. No one said it directly. No one gave instructions. But the scene had its own logic. We were there to fight. They were there to untie her. The mother was there because she was trapped. The faceless monks were there to stop us. I remember the feeling of urgency. The monastery seemed to press in around us. The fog thickened and thinned. The stone walls felt alive with darkness. The robed figures kept appearing from places where there should not have been room for them. But we continued. The daughter and I fought. The singer and his girlfriend worked at the bindings. And eventually, something changed. The energy of the place shifted. It was like a pressure lifting. The black-robed figures became fewer. The fog began to break apart. The ruined monastery seemed less solid. Then I felt myself returning. The room came back slowly. First, I noticed the warmth of someone's hand holding mine. Then I noticed the candles. Then the sound of breathing. Then the fact that I was standing in the same place where I had been before, surrounded by people I knew. The ritual was ending. Everyone seemed drained in one way or another. Some people were quiet. Some looked emotional. Some looked as if they had been concentrating very hard. The mother looked exhausted, but calmer than before. The candlelight seemed brighter now that my eyes were open again. I remember feeling completely shaken. Not frightened exactly. More confused than anything else. My heart was beating quickly. I had the strange feeling of having gone somewhere else without moving. I could still picture the monastery in my head. I could still feel the sword in my hand, even though my hands were empty. For a few minutes, I did not know what to say. I kept wondering whether I had simply imagined everything. That would have made sense. We had been told to visualize fog. We were standing in a candlelit room, holding hands, listening to someone speak in a calm, focused voice. Maybe I had been suggestible. Maybe I had gone into a meditative state and built a story out of whatever images came into my mind. But the experience did not feel like a normal daydream. It had its own detail, its own momentum. And more importantly, I had not told anyone what I saw. I did not say anything during the ritual. I did not describe the monastery. I did not mention the swords. I did not mention the faceless black-robed monks. I did not mention the mother tied to a stone table in a ruined chapel. I kept all of it to myself at first, because I did not want to sound ridiculous. After the ritual ended, I finally asked the others what had happened. I wanted them to explain it. I wanted to know whether they had been imagining their own separate things, or whether everyone had been following some kind of guided story that I had somehow missed. So I asked. I told them I had seen something strange. They started describing what they experienced. And as they spoke, I felt colder. They talked about the fog. They talked about entering an old monastery or ruined religious building. They described the mother being restrained on a stone table. They described the singer and his girlfriend trying to untie her. Then they mentioned me. They said that Becky and I had been knights. They said we had swords. They said we were fighting black-robed monks with no faces. They said we were keeping them away while the others freed the mother. I did not tell them any of that first. That is what has stayed with me. They gave details that matched what I had seen. Not vaguely, not in the loose way where people can make anything fit afterward. They mentioned the same setting, the same roles, the same dark-robed faceless figures, the same stone table, the same ruined chapel, the same idea that the singer and his girlfriend were untying the mother while Becky and I fought. I remember sitting there, trying to understand what had just happened. Maybe the mother had guided all of us more specifically than I remember. Maybe she had used words during the ritual that planted the images in our minds. Maybe she described a fog, a monastery, a chapel, and a battle without me consciously noticing it. But I do not remember her saying any of that. I remember only the instruction to visualize going through fog. Everything after that felt like it unfolded on its own. Maybe we all knew the same stories, the same religious imagery, the same fantasy imagery. And our minds created similar scenes because we were in the same emotional setting. A group of people holding hands around candles can influence one another without realizing it. One person's breathing changes. Another person's tension changes. A whispered phrase or a small movement can create a shared emotional response. Maybe the group had already talked about curses, witches, spiritual attacks, and cleansing rituals enough that we all created a similar symbolic story. That is possible. Maybe it was a group visualization. Maybe it was suggestion. Maybe it was a meditation experience where everyone's imagination followed the same path because we were all focused on the same person and the same goal. But even if that is what happened, it was still one of the strangest experiences of my life. I had never been in a ritual before. I had never held hands with a circle of people and felt myself leave a room so completely. I had never pictured a place so vividly that I could remember the texture of its walls, the dampness in the air, the shape of the chapel, and the presence of enemies coming through fog. And I had never heard other people describe the same imagined place afterward. The part that disturbed me most was not the faceless monks. It was the shared detail. If I had been alone, I could have called it a vivid daydream. If someone else had described a different version, I could have assumed everyone had their own inner experience. But they described what I saw, and they described it before I had told them. For a long time afterward, I did not know what to believe. I did not suddenly become someone who practiced rituals regularly. I did not decide I had discovered proof of another world. I did not start thinking I was a knight in some hidden spiritual war. But I could not dismiss it either. Something happened in that room. Maybe it was psychological. Maybe it was spiritual. Maybe it was a combination of belief, suggestion, emotion, and imagination working together in a way people rarely experience. Or maybe, for a short time, we all stepped into the same strange place. I still remember the monastery. I remember the fog rolling around dark stone walls. I remember the weight of a sword in my hand. I remember Becky beside me. I remember faceless figures in black robes moving toward us. I remember the singer and his girlfriend trying to free the mother from a stone table inside a ruined chapel. And I remember the feeling of coming back into the candlelit room, looking at the people around me and realizing they had seen it too. Whatever it was, it did not feel like a story we made up afterward. It felt like something we entered together. And to this day, I still cannot explain it. One time, a friend and I decided to explore an abandoned school late at night. It was one of those decisions that sounds exciting when you are talking about it beforehand, and much less exciting once you are actually standing outside the place in the dark. The building had been empty for a long time. I do not know exactly how long, but long enough that everyone around the area knew it was abandoned. People talked about it sometimes. They said it had been closed for years. They said there was nothing inside except old rooms, broken furniture, graffiti, and whatever had been left behind when the school stopped being used. I had seen abandoned places before, at least from the outside. There is something about them that makes you curious. A building that used to be full of people, noise, lights, and routine suddenly becomes silent. A place where kids used to walk through halls every morning becomes a dark shape behind overgrown grass and broken windows. It feels like the building is holding its breath. That night, my friend wanted to go inside. He was the kind of person who could stay calm in situations that made me nervous. He did not seem easily scared. If he heard a strange noise, he would probably look for the source instead of immediately assuming the worst. He had that steady confidence that made people feel safer around him. I was not like that. Even before we entered the building, I felt uneasy. The school looked wrong in the dark. It was big enough that we could not see all of it at once. Parts of the building disappeared into shadow. The windows looked black. The front entrance was barely visible, except where our flashlights caught the frame of the doors and the old walls around them. There were no lights inside. No cars parked nearby. No sounds of people. No sign that anyone else was there. At least, no sign that we could see. I remember standing outside for a moment and wondering why I had agreed to come. I had already started imagining things. Every dark window looked like it might contain a face. Every patch of overgrown grass seemed like it could hide an animal or another person. The quiet was not peaceful. It felt like the kind of quiet that makes you notice your breathing. My friend was fine. He had his flashlight out and was ready to go. I asked him if he was good. He said, "Yeah, I'm good." That became the phrase he kept repeating throughout the night. Whenever I felt nervous, I would ask him again, "Are you good?" "Yeah, I'm good." He said it casually, as though we were just walking through an ordinary building in the daytime. He did not seem tense. He did not speak quietly. He did not keep looking over his shoulder. That helped me keep going. We found a way inside and entered the school. The moment we stepped through, the air changed. It smelled old, not just dusty, but damp and stale, like rainwater had been sitting somewhere inside the building for years. There was the smell of old wood, cracked plaster, mildew, dirt, and something metallic that I could not identify. The temperature inside felt lower than it had outside, though that may have only been because the building trapped cold air. Our flashlights moved across the entryway. The beams picked up broken tiles, scraps of paper, pieces of old ceiling material, and marks on the walls. There was graffiti in places. Some doors hung slightly open. Others were closed, but their paint was cracked and peeling. It looked like a school, but without any of the things that make a school feel normal. There were no voices, no lockers slamming, no announcements over speakers, no teachers walking through halls, no sound of shoes on the floor. The silence was heavy. Every time one of us moved, the building answered. Our footsteps echoed through the hallway. A small kick of loose tile sounded louder than it should have. The floor creaked under our weight. Sometimes something dripped somewhere far away, and the sound carried through the building in a way that made it difficult to tell where it was coming from. At first, we explored the first level. We looked into empty classrooms, or what we assumed had once been classrooms. Some had old desks pushed against walls. Some had nothing in them except debris. In a few places, faded writing or old decorations were still visible on the walls, though most of it had been damaged by time, water, or people coming through after the school was abandoned. I kept expecting to find someone, not necessarily anything supernatural. Honestly, I was more worried about regular people. An abandoned building at night could have anyone inside it. Other explorers, teenagers drinking, someone looking for a place to sleep, someone who did not want to be found. That fear felt real and reasonable, but mixed in with it was another kind of fear that I did not want to admit. The building felt occupied, even when we could not hear anyone. There were moments when I would stop walking and feel like something was standing farther down the hallway, just outside the edge of the flashlight beam. Every time I swung the light in that direction, there was nothing there, just empty walls. Doors, dust, shadows. I asked my friend again if he was good. "Yeah, I'm good," he said. He did not laugh at me. He did not tell me to stop worrying. He just answered calmly and kept moving. That made me feel slightly better. We explored more of the first floor, then eventually found the staircase leading to the second level. The staircase was one of the worst parts of the building. I do not know why exactly. It was just stairs. There was nothing visibly different about them compared with the rest of the school, but the stairwell felt darker than the halls. It was enclosed, and the sound of our steps seemed louder there. Every footstep echoed upward. The flashlight beams bounced off the walls and railing. We could only see a short distance ahead at a time. The upper part of the stairs disappeared around a bend before reaching the second floor. I remember standing at the bottom, looking up. I did not want to go. I had already been scared the moment we walked into the school, and the stairwell made that feeling worse. Upstairs felt farther away from the entrance. It felt more isolated. If something happened, or if we heard someone below us, we would have fewer ways out. But my friend started heading up, so I followed. That was the pattern of the night. He would keep moving, and I would tell myself not to be the person who ruined the whole adventure because I was too nervous. We climbed the stairs slowly. The building creaked around us. At one point, I heard something above us. It may have been the wood settling. It may have been an animal moving somewhere in the ceiling. It may have been debris shifting after we disturbed the air with our footsteps, but it sounded like a small movement. I stopped for a second. My friend looked back at me. "You good?" he asked. I almost laughed because I had been asking him the same thing all night. "Yeah," I said, though I was not. We kept climbing. The stairs curved around a landing before reaching the second floor. Because of the shape of the stairwell, you could not see the upper hallway until you were almost there. You had to walk around the bend first. My friend was ahead of me by a few steps. I kept my eyes down for part of the climb, watching where I placed my feet. The stairs were old and uneven. There were loose pieces of dirt and broken material on some of them. I did not want to trip or step on something sharp. Then I looked up. At the top of the stairs, in the doorway leading into the second floor hall, there was something hanging in the air. At first, I thought it was smoke. That was the only word my brain could find for it. It looked like a puff of vapor, as if someone had taken a hit from a vape and exhaled into the doorway. But it was not spreading the way smoke normally spreads. It was contained. It was shaped almost like a sphere, a pale gray-white cloud suspended in the darkness near the doorway. It was not huge. It was not filling the hall. It was just there, directly in front of us, floating at about head height near the top of the stairs. For a moment, I could not understand what I was seeing. The flashlight beam touched it, and I could see the edges clearly enough to know it was not a reflection. It looked soft, like smoke, but it held its shape in a way that smoke should not. It did not rise. It did not drift slowly to one side. It did not spread toward the ceiling. It just hovered there, like someone had breathed out a perfectly round cloud and somehow frozen it in place. I stopped walking. My friend stopped too. Neither of us said anything for a second. I stared at it. My mind immediately tried to find an explanation. Maybe it was dust. Maybe our movement had stirred up old dust from the stairwell, and the flashlight made it look thicker than it was. Maybe there was vapor coming from a broken pipe or a vent. Maybe someone had been inside before us and had actually used a vape. Maybe cold air from one room was mixing with warmer air from another and creating some strange visible mist. But none of those explanations matched what I was looking at. The school had been abandoned. There was no obvious reason for vapor to be floating in a clean sphere in the doorway. There was no wind, no air conditioner, no open window nearby that I could see, no sound of someone breathing, coughing, laughing, or walking away, and the shape did not act like smoke. It remained in one place long enough for me to fully register it. Then it moved, not by drifting, not by slowly fading. It whisked away. The best way I can describe it is that it disappeared as though someone had waved a hand through it, or as though someone had walked directly through the middle of it. 1 second, the sphere was there. The next second, it broke apart and vanished. It was gone so fast that I almost wondered whether I had imagined it, but I had barely had time to think that before I turned to my friend. "Did you see that?" I asked. He looked at me. The calm expression he had carried through the entire building was gone. His eyes were wide. He did not say what. He did not ask what I meant. He did not try to laugh it off. He said, "Yeah, let's get the fuck out of here." That was all I needed. We did not keep exploring. We did not go into the second floor hallway. We did not try to find a source for the smoke. We did not take pictures. We did not stand there and debate whether it could have been dust or vapor or a trick of the flashlight. We turned around and left. I remember how fast the stairs felt on the way down. A few minutes earlier, I had been nervous about climbing them slowly. Now I wanted to be at the bottom as fast as possible. I kept expecting to hear someone behind us. I kept expecting a door to close upstairs. I kept expecting the cloud to appear again on the stairs below us. Nothing happened. We reached the first floor and moved quickly through the halls toward the exit. The building felt larger than it had before. Every dark room we passed seemed deeper. Every open doorway looked like something might be standing just inside. I did not want to shine my flashlight into the classrooms anymore. I did not want to look too closely at any shadow. I just wanted out. My friend was moving faster too. That was what really scared me. He had been fine when we first entered. He had been steady and relaxed. He had answered every question with the same simple response. "Yeah, I'm good." But after seeing that strange cloud at the top of the stairs, he did not try to act brave. He did not say it was nothing. He did not tell me I was overreacting. He wanted to leave immediately. We got out of the school and back into the open air. I remember the outside feeling strange too. It was still dark, but the darkness outside felt safer than the darkness inside the building. At least outside, there was space. There was sky above us. There were distant streetlights. There were normal night sounds. Inside the school, everything had been trapped. The silence, the shadows, the smell, the feeling that something could be in the room beside you without making a sound. We walked away quickly. Neither of us said much at first. I think we were both trying to process what we had seen. Eventually, we started talking about it. We went through the possible explanations. Maybe somebody had been inside before us. Maybe a person had vaped in the hallway and left just before we came up. But then, why had the vapor remained shaped like a sphere? Why had it not spread? Why did we not hear anyone moving? Maybe it was dust. Old buildings have dust everywhere. Flashlight beams can make dust look thick and strange, especially when it is stirred up in a dark hall. But dust does not usually appear as one contained cloud in a doorway, then disappear as if something passed through it. Maybe it was mist from a pipe or a leak, but there was no hissing, no obvious broken pipe, no steady vapor, and no reason for it to appear for only a few seconds. Maybe it was a trick of our eyes. Maybe the flashlight beams crossed in a way that made the air look solid. Maybe exhaustion, fear, and expectation made us see a shape in ordinary darkness. That would be easier to accept if only one of us had seen it. But we both did. I asked him immediately. He understood what I meant immediately, and he wanted to leave immediately. We never went back. That night ended my interest in exploring abandoned buildings. Before that, I thought it was exciting. I thought it was creepy in a fun way. You walk through old rooms, tell yourself it is just a building, and enjoy the adrenaline of doing something you probably should not be doing. After that, it stopped feeling fun. Maybe we saw something completely normal and did not understand it. Maybe the building had old ventilation that released a small burst of dust or moisture. Maybe someone really had been there before us and had exhaled vapor into the air at the exact wrong moment. Maybe the smoke sphere was nothing more than a strange effect of our flashlights in a dusty stairwell. I cannot prove otherwise, but I know what it looked like. I know it was contained. I know it was in the doorway at the top of the stairs. I know it vanished too quickly and too strangely to feel normal. And I know my friend saw it too. The strange thing is that I do not remember much about the school after that. I do not remember what the classrooms looked like. I do not remember the graffiti or the broken furniture as clearly as I remember the stairwell. I remember the bend in the stairs. I remember looking up. I remember the pale sphere hanging in the doorway. And I remember it disappearing as though someone invisible had moved through it. Then I remember my friend, who had been calm the entire time, saying the only thing either of us needed to hear. Yeah, let's get the fuck out of here. We did. And I never explored abandoned buildings again. The lights may be back on, but that does not always mean the danger is gone. Every person you heard tonight had one thing in common. They saw, heard, or felt something that changed the way they looked at darkness forever. Tell me in the comments which story stayed with you the most. Subscribe to The Blackout Witness for more true stories from the moments people wish they could forget. And tonight, before you switch off the last light in your room, look twice at the window.